Hi there. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Bonsai Stuff podcast. I'm Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu, as you're well aware, and this is episode 40 in season 6 of the podcast. Time just seems to be flying past now. Thanks for coming back, as always. Love the patronage, love the connection that we've got, and love it that you're so fanatical about bonsai that I feel like we're sort of one and the same, which is really nice. I want to talk about a couple of things in this podcast. One is going to be very helpful, I think, which is a bit of maintenance tasks that I do and things that I'm targeting at the moment and things that you should keep an eye out for around the yard, which will be, like I said, very helpful. The second part is, which I hope doesn't upset anybody, but I'm going to talk about a bonsai styling design that doesn't, I'm trying to think of a nice word for dislike strongly, that doesn't resonate with me. And I'm not sure, I know reasons why, but I know it's a very common, a very popular styling choice. A lot of people work towards it, but I've got a different approach based on some recent experience that I've got. So I'll talk about that in the podcast as well. And hopefully by the end of it, we're still friends. You still you can see where I'm coming from, and it maybe just opens your eyes to a few more design choices. I won't use big words going into the design side of bonsai. I'll keep it really, really Bonsai Matsu, simple, approachable, understandable, and we'll see where this takes us. So hopefully, like I said, you're listening next week as well. But no, I'm sure you will. I'm just being facetious. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So let's get into it. Okay, so I've decided with this podcast to start with the maintenance type things, the stuff that's really important that we do around the yard, stuff that's on my mind, I focus on before you get to the next section, hit the stop button. No, I'm just joking. All right, so at the moment you think about where we are in the scheme of things, and we're a fair way into spring now, halfway, smack in the middle of where spring is. Trees have had a lot of good growth. You've been able to harness that. Hopefully, you've been pushing the trees a little bit. One thing that I just remind you of and make you very mindful of at the moment is wire removal, especially on deciduous trees. Anything that you've wired, younger trees more so, and it doesn't matter if they're young trees and you're in development. Just be very careful of that scarring, the trunk scarring especially. That stuff can be there for forever. Like, you'll never get rid of it, and you'll be kicking yourself for it if you don't do something about it. Something like a maple or a beech or something like that. Once they're scarred, especially if it's deep gouge scars, they're not your friend. It's something definitely that I look for and am very mindful of when I look through nursery stock or look to acquire trees, is that scarring. Cedars, oh my God, cedars are notorious for it. Once they get that deep scarring on their trunk, it's half the job's done. No matter how good you make the tree, that scarring, for the next 20 years can be something that you look at. So while I say you've got to be careful of wire cutting in, and I err on the side of caution on some species, like natives, I'm very, very careful with natives that they don't cut in too far, because it can be disastrous. And I find that with natives too, if it cuts in too deep and you go to remove it, that branch is really quite weak from there on forward, because it gets quite thin at that point where the wire's cut in, especially if I've done some pretty serious bending at that point as well, and it becomes brittle. And I find that that's when I can get something that dies off on the branch, or even breaks off at some future point. So I try to be very mindful of the wire cutting, especially now, mid-spring, perfect time to get your peepers out and have a look. And started the spring season walking around with my pinching apparatus, my tools my fine tweezers that I pinch a lot of the deciduous growth with, to now at this time of the year I'm walking around with wire cutters in my back pocket, because if it's starting to cut in now and I leave it for a couple of days, it can be too long. You've been ploughing in fertilizer, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second, but you've been putting fertilizer into these trees, you've been building the strength of them, building up their vitality and their health, and they're swelling, they're growing, they're loving it, they're pushing, they're elongating, they're thickening, they're doing all the stuff that you're asking them to do. So if the wire stays on there, it can be disastrous. Okay, so that said, if you've got your conifers in the garden, take out cedars, but generally I'm talking pines at the moment, especially something like a white pine or a spruce, something like that. Then I don't mind. I really don't mind, and this is my approach to it, not the world approach. This is what my approach is. That I don't mind if that cutting occurs a little bit within reason. Let's use that term, within reason, because if it's a little bit, and it's up to you to determine whether it's too much or it's not enough, but a little bit of cutting on species like that, and I really get the benefit of that branch being held long term. And I think that for me, wiring's awesome at those early stages of development. You know, the trunk and the vari, the primary branches. You may be on the secondary branches, but then after that, I try and move towards more of a clip and grow or prune as the direction you want the branch to grow methodology or approach to maintaining the style. But I think that letting it cut in just a little bit on those species means that I'm not going to have to go back and wire that branch. Or if I do it, it's maybe one more slight wire and hold it in place for a little bit longer, but then that's it. I know I'm completely done. Whereas if I remove it too quickly and there's no cutting on those pine species, pine varieties, then I find that I'm back to square one. The branch scallops up. I've got to look at reapplying the wire, and it's a real long-term approach that, you know, as this tree develops and as one turns into two over and over and over, that wiring back in close gets very hard without doing some kind of damage. So I try very early days to let a bit of cutting to occur, and then, you know, I manage it from there out. But it's yeah, it's definitely something that's on my radar at the moment, is that wire removal, especially on species where scarring is going to be a long-term issue. And, you know, if you don't know which ones are which, err on the side of caution and remove it, and maybe reach out and just check with, you know, check with some locals. You know, ask the question, hey, which one should cut in a little bit more, which ones shouldn't, you know, which ones need it, which ones don't, which ones are never going to get over it. And if you just as a heads up, if you walk around, like I said earlier, if you walk around a bonsai nursery and you look at their trunks and look for scarring, especially on older stock, they're the ones to take note of, that it'll never get better as time progresses for that tree. All right, so wire removal is a big one. Fertilizing, definitely a big one. You should be well and truly into your second round of fertilizing for your trees at this period. And if you have any inclination at all to do decandling on black and red pines, or candle cutting on those single flush species that can handle it, then yeah, you need to be on top of your game when it comes to fertilizing. Also, if you're going to be looking at defoliation, now's not a bad time to start thinking about it, and it's something that will be talked about in the next episode of the podcast, is defoliation. That's how close it's getting. So, you know, if I'm looking at that partial, complete, you know, sectional defoliation process on any of the species that can handle it, then there's definitely a change in my, or a close monitoring of my fertilizing of those trees, to make sure that I'm putting them in the best position possible to make sure that they can bounce out the other side stronger than what they were, and that I'm not going to do something stupid and make the trees weaker, or, you know, or set them back from where they are. So I've had a lot of questions about fertilizing. I love it. It's that time of year where I think that whether it's, you know, via YouTube or it's direct messages, it's a lot of questions about fertilizing and my methodologies and my approach. And I'm very consistent, as I am with a hell of a lot of stuff that I do with bonsai. I try and make it that it's simple, it's repeatable, it's easy, it's consistent, it's predictable. All that stuff that I say over and over till I'm blue in the face, but it's true. And you know, I can bank on, and this is times like right now when I'm thinking of things I have to do in the future. You know, what I'm planning for in 1 to 2 months in the future, and taking steps now to say, well, okay, that tree's going to get decandled. It looks good, but it could be stronger. Okay, at this point in time, what do I need to do to increase its strength or its health? What steps do I need to take now to make sure that, you know, we can improve this tree into the future, and things like fertilizing for me. Okay, well, I know one bag will give me a certain response on a tree of that size that hasn't been repotted for however long, or 2 bags will give me a response, or 4 bags will give me a response, or 6 bags depending on the size of the pot. So whatever it is, I can factor in all these things, and sort of within a range. It's never, I can't predict it, exactly what it's going to be, but I know that by doing certain things, I can say, well, okay, everything being equal, based on all the experience that I've had with this species and this size tree and this historical information on the tree, like how it's growing now, how it looks, what the spring candles look like. Okay, by taking certain steps now, I know that I can look at the decandling process in the future and make sure that it's going to be as successful as it possibly can be. So it's that foresight, that thinking about the future now and taking steps now for everything that makes such a massive difference to your trees. The other last little bit of maintenance talk that I want to wrap up with is on cedars. So cedars, by now, your buds should have opened. If they've been repotted, you might have had a few needles get dropped along the way, the older needles, as part of a shock process. They should have been reintroduced to the wild. They should be growing quite nicely. You may well be developing spears, which is long shoots. You might have them where they've just sort of opened up. The needles are coming out. You might have had talk about holding back fertilizer and that sort of stuff to try and keep the needles shorter. Definitely not something that I profess to follow. As I said, I'm all about strength and health of the tree. Don't overdo it with them, but I definitely make sure that I'm fertilizing them adequately enough. And needle length is one of those things that I sort out somewhere down the track. It doesn't need to be right here, right now for the tree. So if you do have cedars and those spears have grown out, it's probably about now that you're going to want to start looking at pruning. And if you want sacrifice branches on a cedar, now's a great time to prune around the apex, contain that area, let those lower spears continue to grow and push out and thicken and strengthen the tree. But it's it's one of those things now that with my cedars, it's almost time in the next let's call it 3 or 4 week period where they're going to start making a bit of a trek into the workshop, where I'll have a look at them and see if they need to be pruned, maintained, just the allocation of resources checked on those trees, because they've had a good run and it's probably time to review them and see where they're at. Righto. So now you know that I love you. You know that I love your company. You know that I want you to come back. I am definitely not trying to be controversial with this, but I want to talk to you about a style of bonsai that really doesn't do very much for me. It's the windswept style. Now, I don't use the word hate very much in my life, and I'm not going to use it in this circumstance, but I feel strongly about it, right? Which is why I wanted to talk about it on the podcast. And there are people in the bonsai world that are very good at windswept. That from their perspective, there are people that love the windswept approach. It's a go-to for their designs, and that's cool. This podcast is me airing my thoughts, trying to, I suppose, look at things from a slightly different perspective, or from my perspective, and just explain myself. So
we'll be right back.
Welcome to Practical Wisdom for Leaders, the podcast where we help you become a great leader. I'm Dr. Scott Allen, and each week I engage with world leaders, senior executives, nonprofit trailblazers, and professors from universities around the globe. We explore all aspects of leadership: executive development, personal growth, bad leadership, women in leadership, decision-making, and so much more. Tune into Practical Wisdom for Leaders for critical insights to help you lead and live with purpose.
it would be unfair, remiss of me to not talk about it at some stage in this podcast, because there's justification, and I've got a solution. This is going to be a positive part of the podcast, I promise. So when I think about the Windswept style, the reason why I don't like it is it doesn't appeal to me, is that it just looks so artificial and it looks man-made. And I know that's funny. I know that seems absolutely absurd thing to say when you talk about bonsai, because everything we do is man-made. Even when we collect a tree or trees collected from the wild that's lived there happily for 1,000 years, first thing we do is impose our will on it and design it and force it to look a certain way that complies with the bonsai world. And I know it's ironic, which it's a bit silly to be saying that I don't like it because it's man-made and it's artificial, but it's true. Like, I think it looks unrealistic, like it looks forced. So you take a beautiful young tree of whatever kind. The most common that I seem to see is a juniper, so I'll use that as the example. But you get a beautiful little juniper that's grown in a garden pot. It's got branches spiraling out of this thing in all directions, 360 degrees of branches. And then the design idea comes up for a windswept. So that means all the branches have to be on one side of the trunk. It has to look like the winds hit this thing at 1,000,000 miles an hour and the branches are wrapped around. So you take these really strong lower branches, because the lower branches are always thicker, because they're the oldest ones on the tree. And you take these big, strong, healthy branches and you circle them around the trunk and you push them. Let's say it's growing to the left, just for sake of visualization, growing to the left, and we arc it around and we push it to the right-hand side of the tree. Now, I don't ever see how that would be possible to me. And I've always found it very awkward and clumsy. And, to understand that this tree is growing this, in the real world, has grown very strongly to the left, and all of a sudden something's changed and that wind started hitting that tree, and that tree branch has then started to bow around to the right-hand side slowly over decades, and then push out to the right-hand side of the tree. It just never happens. But it seems to be that's the windswept motto, is to take every branch that you've got on that tree and buckle them around to the opposite side of the tree, have the trunk slanting, the apex over to that side, so movement of the trees to that, the visual right-hand side of the tree, and all the foliage is out to the right-hand side. And I get it. I do. I get it, but it looks forced. It looks unnatural. It just looks like something in my brain says, no, that's not how it works. All right, so here's the part where I'm going to offer an alternative and my 2 cents worth. The Bonsai Matsu Scott Martin 2 cents worth of what I think a brilliant alternative is to that approach of windswept, where you take every single branch on the tree and you wrap them around. Now, this comes from a real world experience. I was recently driving across the Nullarbor of Australia, which goes across the base of Australia. For those that aren't aware, from east to west, west to east. It's just like a straight line, effectively, that cuts across the lower section of Australia, and it gets close to the ocean, close to the coastal areas, rugged, remote, exposed. That's the thing. There's no mountain range between you and the ocean. It's just very flat land, and the trees there, in Nullarbor stand, means no trees, but there definitely are lots of trees around that area in different sections, and they get exposed to the elements. And this is where, when I was driving along, it was like a light bulb moment for me. I do it instinctively when I design trees, but it was a real light bulb moment for me as to why I like to think about the design being wind affected design and not wind swept. So take swept out of it. It's wind affected. So this area, this one in particular, that sticks in my mind clear as day, and I can see the trees there right now. It appears as though the wind was blowing, we're driving east to west across, and the wind was blowing very strongly and hitting the side of the car from the south. And when I looked at all the trees around that area, that wind must do that very consistently, because all the trunks of the trees, I'll just talk about the trunks for a minute, all the trunks sort of started coming up straight out of the ground and then bowed across. As I'm driving from east to west, they were bowing towards the north, so to the right-hand side. So the wind's coming from the left, and the trunks are all bowing across to that right-hand side of the road, or for their growth. And it was a beautiful vision of seeing trees that are affected by the natural elements. Whether it's something growing under the base of another tree and has to reach out and sort of stretch for light and air. So those trunks start to bow out like we see on the outer periphery of forests, which is why I love forests that sort of bow out to the sides, because that's what the trees want to do naturally, is to reach out for that sunlight. So to see these trees that were affected by this really strong wind was really super interesting. So then as you start to work your way up the trunk, you can see on the wind side of the trees where it must blow there. A vast majority of time must come from that direction to have that sort of an impact over such a long period of time. Those wind affected designs have to be coming from that left hand side of the tree to push it towards the right hand side. So what had happened with the branches that were growing on the left hand side of the tree, obviously there's lulls in that wind. The wind can't blow constantly like that forever. All right, if it did, I think you'd find that the branch would buckle around the trunk at that point. But it doesn't. The wind stops and starts. So you might find that during a period of growth, when the tree's young especially, it pushes out branches all over all around its trunk, like that little juniper in the pot, 360-degree of branches. But then those branches that are on the wind side of the tree, they would grow, they would struggle, they would get weaker over time because they're being battered. They're still trying to grow out to that left-hand side. They're not wrapping around the trunk. They're not being artificially pushed around that trunk. They get to a certain point and then they died. So the left-hand side, the wind side of the tree, had a massive amount of these dead branches at all different heights, right the way up towards the apex of the tree. So you've got the leaning trunk, you've got all these dead branches. Often there would be some dead wood on that side of the tree as well, because it just gets pummeled by the wind. But on the side away from the wind, then you'd find that they were really healthy. Those branches were growing exactly as you would expect. The apex was pushed across to the right-hand side of these trees. It was very strong, very nice, maybe not as broad as you'd find on a typical informal upright or an upright tree, a formal upright tree, but definitely strong and had that lean towards the right-hand side. So in the natural environment, this tree was leaning to the right, the apex was going to the right, and everything felt like it was moving to the right-hand side. Then you come down the tree, just like you would a bonsai in a pot, a tree in a pot, and you see those branches that are lower down that are reaching out further than the apex to get the sunlight. So they had that real triangle silhouette in a natural environment. And they were healthy. They were strong because these dead branches on the wind side of the tree were sheltering that non-wind side of the tree and allowing it to grow and do what it's got to do. So the tree was protected and was allowed to do what it wants to do in that environment. And I think that seeing that occur in the like I said, in the real world, it just gave me a real opportunity, I suppose, to talk about it, but also to say, well, that's why I don't like windswept design, because it doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like that tree that has been battered with 100 km/h winds consistently from the south and then allowed to grow a little bit. Then the wind comes back, and I'm sure the wind blows from all directions, but clearly as you drive along and you see these vast stretches of trees all leaning the same way, it's like, well, they're all affected by the same thing. They're all affected by the wind in the same direction. And when you go from one tree to the next, to the next, to the next, and they've all got that same characteristic. They've all got those dead branches on the left side. They've all got the apex pointing out to the right-hand side, and they've got those super healthy branches that are all veering out to the right-hand side. Not one branch that I saw on any tree, and trust me, I was looking hard for it. Not one branch on those trees did I see wrapping around from the wind side to the protected side of the tree. Not one, not one. And that's why when I was looking at them, I'd be saying every tree I drove past almost, it felt like there was millions of them. Look at that. That is amazing. That is just beautiful. There's lovely taper. There's movement in the trunk. It's like, God, if I could capture that in a bonsai, that is perfection. That is so, I don't know, it's realistic's not the right word that I want, but it was just beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And it just touched me somewhere deep inside my bonsai soul, to the point that as soon as I stopped that afternoon, I just had to make notes about it, because it's something that, it's easy to say, so easy, as you should all know, to be negative in this world, especially when it comes to design, which is one of the reasons I don't talk about it a lot. And it's really simple to shoot things down and say, it looks rubbish. But it's fine to think that, but what's the alternative? What's your positive spin on these things? How do you make it better? How do you improve bonsai? Don't just look at it and say, crap, no good, rubbish. It's like, okay, why? Why is it no good? Don't just pick flaws in it. Look for some kind of possibility to make it better. And that's what the driving across the Nullarbor did for me. And seeing these trees that are wind affected, I'm never gonna talk about or suggest a windswept design ever again in my entire life, I don't think. And if I do, I apologise. But no, seriously, I think that from here on out for me, it's going to be this focus on that wind affected, and being. I know it's man-made. I know we're affecting the tree design, and I know we're putting our thumbprint on these trees whenever we work with them. But it'll give it a more natural, a believable feel to it, and something that I can look at and stop and smile and enjoy and cherish. And people that aren't in that bonsai realm like we are, maybe they can appreciate it as well and see something. I definitely don't. I don't subscribe to the theory that trees have to have a story for how they're designed. I don't. I don't think that you have to look at a tree and say, this tree was designed looking at it that, it had been through a bushfire and then a koala came over and broke the branch, and I don't profess to that. But I do like the feeling of looking at a tree going, that looks great. That looks really nice. And when things are right, but you also know when things are wrong. And again, for me, this is a very personal thing for me. But when I look at windswept trees, I don't necessarily have that affinity with them, that affection that I look at them and go, that looks great. I often look at them and think, it just doesn't look like it's going to pass the test of time. It's just never going to grow like that. Whereas these wind affected trees, I think can have a big planet, and it's different from a slanting style. I don't want to get into all the different styles because they really don't interest me. But I think if a tree talks to you and you're looking at it, and maybe there's some dead branches on one side of the tree when you first look at it, and there's a bit of shari, a bit of dead wood on that trunk line as well, then maybe that thought of looking at a wind affected design might be a nice approach, a nice alternative, as opposed to thinking about maybe a windswept. Anyway, like I said, my 2 cents worth. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, I still love you, and if you've got windswept trees and they're your favourite ones in your collection, then that's great. Whatever makes you get out there and spend time with your trees, as I've always said, as long as you're happy, then I'm happy. But hey, it's enough for a chat and enough for a think about. So there we are. You still there? You still listening? You haven't hit the stop button? Shuffle forward, unsubscribe? No, I'm sure you haven't. So I hope you found that interesting, and I hope you see the point that I'm making about trying to make something that's more believable. And I think in the world of bonsai, for me, it's super important to have that feeling with a tree, and the styling comes second to that connection, to that feeling you've got with a tree. If you've got that feeling and Windswept is the go, then that's great. I'm not trying to change the world one Windswept tree at a time. I'm just trying to open your thought process when you look at things, and that term wind affected as opposed to windswept just sort of rings a bit truer for me. And I'm sure there's other designs that you're probably saying, hey, why isn't he talking about informal upright? Why does it always have to do this? And why does it always have to... Look, that's the same with any design, and it's just it's just my 2 cents worth, I suppose. As I was saying earlier in the start of the podcast, this mid-spring is an important time. It's a time for you to make sure that you're doing good, that you're doing the right things by your trees. Weeds are a pain. Just seriously, just stay on top of all that crappy maintenance. Everything should have a bit of a haircut by now. You're probably looking at planning that 1 to 2 months in the future, that decandling process, the defoliation process, where you're heading to with those. For me, I'm thinking about different things too, like repotting natives, figs, the work for them down in Melbourne as we get towards a warmer part. Not that it's been terribly warm, but we are certainly hitting higher temperatures around the place, which means that in a short period of time, summer will be here. There'll be definitely more talk coming up about watering systems and camera systems and prevention and making sure you got redundancies, all that usual stuff that we talk about. But for now, just focus in on those couple of things. Your cedars, scarring, wire, all that sort of stuff, fertilizing, making your plans for the future, making sure that you can achieve them. Thank you for listening in. I love it. I really do. I appreciate every single one of you. You're listening. You're very special to me, and you mean a lot, and I appreciate the support. Until next time, as always, happy bonsai.